Okay,
Thank
guys.
you, first off, for having us here this afternoon. I thought I'd add a little bit of an extra attraction here, so I have Lady Washington also accompany me this afternoon as well. Now, April for me is a very important month, especially today's date, 14th of April, 1789. A gentleman knocks on the door of my home in Mount Vernon, Senator Thompson, to notify me that I was unanimously elected as the first president of these United States of America.
Huzzah!
Now, I had 2 days to prepare to leave my home to begin my journey to the city of New York, our very first capital. So I'm not leaving till the 16th. But I also have a big dilemma. I guess you could say I'm a little bit too generous, especially with friends of mine lending them money. A little short on cash for my journey to my own inauguration. So I'm asking friends, of course, they don't have any money, so there was a gentleman in Virginia, in the Northern Neck, that decided he's going to lend me some money. So now I have the funds. I borrowed about 500 pounds. I didn't get too far from my home when I got to the city of Alexandria, because I ended up having to have a dinner for the city elders and the founders there as well, and of course numerous speeches. So you can see this is going to be a very, very long journey to the city of New York. So from Alexandria, of course, I had to make a stopover in the city of Baltimore. From Baltimore, of course, I'm entering the city of Philadelphia. And when I'm crossing the river into Philadelphia, there is this elaborate arch that was created by an artist. And there's these young ladies dressed up as Roman maidens, putting flowers at my feet as I'm riding my horse, Nelson, across this river. And all of a sudden, I noticed from the corner of my eye, a young lad, much smaller than you, by the way, being lowered on a rope, dressed as a cherub, holding a laurel wreath for a crown to be put on my head. And it's quite embarrassing, actually. A lot of people don't realize I'm a very quiet person. And to be treated as such, as this, I'm a monarch, a king, which of course we fought against for 8 long years to gain our independence, to have that wreath being put on my head, it's extremely touching, and I'd never forget it. But more so was touching when I crossed over the river, when I got to the city of Trenton, New Jersey. Now that one was even more heart-wrenching to watch. These young ladies singing songs of praise to the tune of God Save the King, only as God saved great General Washington. There's a banner that said, the defender of mothers will also defend daughters. When I saw that, tears started to well up in my eyes. And as I continued my journey, now I started on the 16th. By the time it's around the 22nd, I'm in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. And of course, more speeches, more dinners to sit at. And then the day came when I had to cross the harbor into New York City. This is the 23rd of April, 1789. There's a flotilla of ships in the harbor, a parade, and they built a barge, a presidential barge for me to ride in. 13 oarsmen dressed in blue and white uniforms. And as they started to row closer and closer to the lower tip of Manhattan Island, where the artillery battery happens to be, there was a 13-gun salute for me. I also noticed there was landing craft, small little boats on the side of the barge that I was sitting in. Now this barge is about 60 feet long. And there's, of course, people singing my praises again to all these familiar tunes from my day. But when those cannons went off, there was a Spanish warship that a band played on board that ship and unfurled all the flags of all the nations that helped us gain our independence. It was quite a touching moment. But deep down, I felt like I was extremely embarrassed by this. Who am I to get all this praise while we had upwards throughout the war for independence 70 to 75,000 men fighting for 8 long years for our independence. Finally, when the boat arrived at the foot of Wall Street, when I was met with Governor George Clinton and other dignitaries, I do remember whispering in his ears, "Please don't embarrass me like this ever again." Of course, nobody listens. You all know that from your history. It happens again and again. So now I'm expected to make my way to the first presidential mansion, which was on number 3 Cherry Street. And it was very hard to do. If you could imagine, down over here, this is the lower tip of Manhattan Island. That is the city. It's not like what you're used to seeing or hearing about. Very small area. There was about 10,000 people crammed into that little area to witness the first inauguration. 10,000. There wasn't a room or a bed to be had in a tavern. I could not get down the street in the coach that was provided for me to get to my new home. I had to walk. And I didn't arrive to my home till 11 o'clock at night. That's how closely packed the streets were. Now, the inauguration, I guess it will be the closest thing we're going to get to witnessing a coronation. And that's how I felt at that moment. But we didn't get there yet. Remember, this is just the 23rd, so I have a few more days to go. 7 more days before the actual inauguration takes place at the first Capitol building on Wall Street, which you today call Federal Hall, which was the original City Hall building back then. And when that day arrived, on April 30th, I'm waiting outside my home. Guess what happens? The coach that was supposed to take me to my inauguration showed up late. So Mr. Beekman generously lent his coach. And it's rumored that that coach is on the 4th floor of a historical society in Manhattan. I've seen it many times, of course, other than riding into it to my inauguration. So around 12 noon, I go out onto the balcony. My good friend John Adams was there, our first vice president. Mr. Livingston, he administered the oath. And I remember that moment the way it was. I'm there about, I guess it was about 20 feet above the street level where the balcony was. And in front of me, on the street there, Broad and Wall Street, must have been 10 to 20,000 people witnessing this historical event. People were so crammed together, you could probably walk upon their heads to get into one end, all the way down to the lower tip of the island, where Mr. Samuel Francis Tavern sat. But I guess you could say that was one of the most magical moments in my life. How did we get there? It was a long fight to get our independence. Even we had a discussion early on before the inauguration, what am I going to wear? The number one wool manufacturer in the world at this time is Great Britain. Do we want to use British wool? We want local manufacturer. I told my good friend Henry Knox to see if you could acquire some. And he did, from the state of Connecticut. Wonderful brown wool. It's one of my favorite suits that I wear. I wear every year on the anniversary, actually, of the inauguration. So that's one hurdle we had to come over. We need to start manufacturing our own goods here. Another thing also, how are we going to run the presidency? What is a presidency? We don't know. This is what Mr. Franklin and others was calling the grand experiment. What do we do here? What's my job? Well, at first my job was to meet Tuesday afternoons at the presidential mansion. And thank goodness I have my wife as a lovely hostess to help me out there. We had to hold luncheons. Dignitaries would come by. I'm standing behind a velvet rope, shaking hands with ambassadors. So I guess this is the closest thing you're going to get to with an uncrowned king. Thursday evenings was the very same thing going on. And then my good friend, Thomas Jefferson. Don't know what was going on in his mind at that time. But later on I did find out. When he started paying Benjamin Franklin Bache, some people refer to him as Lightning Jr. Of course, he's Benjamin Franklin's grandson. He's in the same business as publishing newspapers, pamphlets, political ones, by the way. Mr. Jefferson had him print one accusing me and my good friend Mr. Adams of being princes and monocrats living in our palaces. And of course, Mr. Jefferson doesn't get along with Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Jefferson doesn't get along also with my good friend Adams, and they're fighting throughout their whole entire lives. So we have that going on as well.
General, that wouldn't be the first time.
No, it wasn't the first time. It was one of many times. Do you remember early on in the war when I had officers scheming behind my back?
Oh yes, I do indeed, especially that one officer, Lee.
Oh yes, where he wanted to take command of the army. I was able to get hold of one of those letters. And then of course the big problem towards the end of the war. You remember in March of 1782, when the mutiny was supposed to take place.
Indeed.
And luckily I got hold of that letter and I was able to quell that mutiny. And it was very simple. Because when I was there in the village of New Windsor at the last winter cantonment of the Continental Army, and all the officers gathered on that March 15th, pulled these out of my pocket. I made a comment. I was reading that letter. Not only have I gone gray in the service of my country, I've also gone blind. At this point, nobody realized I wore spectacles in order to read. I could see fine far away, but close up, it's almost impossible. But it's been a very, very long time to get where we are, to get our independence. And that moment when I was there, standing there on the balcony, of course you all know it was not always that way. I can think of another April in 1776, when I first came down here to Westchester County and spend the night at Guyan's Tavern right around the corner from the Church of Eastchester, which you call St. Paul's Church today, on my way to New York City to assume command of the New York garrison, which was under Israel Putnam. And the following day, on the 13th, was when I finally entered the city. I didn't know what to expect. Where we are right now was the neutral ground during the War for Independence. Neutral zone. You can wake up any moment, and you'll never know from morning to morning who controls the area. It could be our army, the Continental Army. It could be the British Army. And this went on day after day. Could you imagine you're fighting against your brother? Imagine your brother or your father is loyal to the King of England and you are not? Don't speak to each other ever again? I know such of a gentleman that I was told when I first visited the Church of Eastchester, when I spent my night at Guyan's Tavern all the way back in 1776. And there was a gentleman that was part of that church, Jonathan Fowler. Jonathan Fowler happened to have been a lawyer. And when his son, Theodosius, joined the Continental Army in March of 1776, they never spoke to each other ever again.
We do know of another sad, similar situation, Dr. Franklin and his own son.
Oh, absolutely.
Just
Dr. Franklin and his son. He doesn't speak to him ever again either. He sees him one more time after the war. They speak for 15 minutes in London. And Dr. Franklin takes his grandson back with him to live in America. It's very sad. And even my own mother was suspected of being a loyalist. She never congratulated me in being commander of the army. She never congratulated me on the moment when I became the first president of these United States. So secretly, well, I can understand she's a bit older. She's set in her ways.
But General, you must understand the stress that your mother was under.
That is true.
Do you remember?
Oh, I remember the problems we had.
Indeed.
Especially when I was growing up. I'm 11 years old, and that's when my father died suddenly. And of course, my mother doesn't have much in the way of funds for the family. Now, I wanted so badly to go to the school that my half-brother Lawrence went to in London called Applebee's. My other brother Sammy went there as well. My mother didn't have the funds to send me to England. Now my education, my formal education, actually ended when I was 15 years old. I'm very good at math, so I guess that's why I decided by the time I was 16 years old, I knew I wanted to be a surveyor measuring land. That was my first love, being part of the landed gentry, measuring property. And you could say that was the beginning of my career in education, but I sorely would have loved to have joined the Royal Navy at that point. You see, my half-brother Lawrence was telling me about the glories of war, a battle that he was at called the Battle of Jenkins' Ear. Very funny sounding name for a battle. And it was all over a spat because some officer had his ear cut off. And most of the people, most of the British on that side that was on board the ship that my half-brother was on, they suffered very badly from a disease called the bloody flux. And we won't get into what that actually is. If an adult wants to know later on, I'll be more than happy to tell you. So I want to join the Royal Navy. By the time I'm about 15 years old, my mother says no, it's not going to happen. Now her mentor was George Erskine, and that's who actually I'm named for. A lot of people think I'm named for King George II, because when I was born, he was the King of England. A lot of people did name their children after members of the British royal family back then. And George Erskine told my mother, you are not going to let your son join the Navy because he's going to be treated worse than a slave. He's going to be treated like a dog. So what am I going to do? Here I am. I'm 15 years old. I want some adventure in life. I want to possibly maybe grow up to be a commander in the British Army. Okay, thank God. That never happened for us. So what am I supposed to do? But when I discovered, by working with a good friend who taught me how to be a surveyor, that's what was my first love, measuring property. My first true job was through the Fairfax family, which we're related through marriage. Lord Fairfax hired me to measure hundreds of thousands of acres of land. And I can tell you that was the first time I slept in a tavern when I was 16, and I decided, well, I got to be careful sleeping in taverns. Because you know what happens sometimes when you sleep in a tavern? You're up all night, you're scratching and itching, the beds aren't exactly clean, the mattress is maybe just a piece of cloth with a few pieces of straw. That evening that I slept in a tavern for the first time, it was far worse than that. I'm scratching myself all night long. 2/3 of the weight of that wool blanket was in vermin and insects. So I'm warning you, especially for the younger ones in this crowd, do not sleep in a tavern. You're better off sleeping under the stars underneath a tree.
Had that been under my management, that never would have happened.
Oh, that I know.
And you should also, I think, give a break to your mother. Yes, she had a very hard-scrabble life, and she was strict and ruled with an iron fist and a velvet glove. However, she expected all of her children to amount to something big.
That is true. And I guess I'm the one who amounted to the biggest, which nobody would have expected. Because think about it. Think about where I'm living. We're middling sort, living in Fredericksburg, Virginia. How far am I going to go in life? But I guess I had a lot of good connections too, because I became friends with the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. That, of course, starts my military career under Governor Dinwiddie. When he gives me a task to go out to the Ohio Territory to try to expel some French troops that are not supposed to be there because, of course, it's claimed crown property, belongs to the British colonies. And, of course, we know that disaster would happen. They didn't listen. When I brought the letter back months later to the Lieutenant Governor, I was told I have to go back again with 250 men and made Lieutenant Colonel of the Virginia Regiment, which is something I was very, very proud of at that time. But each time when I felt I want to move a little bit further, I want to command more troops, possibly a commission in the regular standing British Army as a regular colonel, because I saw during that war that I called the 7 Years' War, you call the French and Indian War, the abuses of the British officers towards us. I was treated no better than a corporal in the British Army. Meanwhile, I have the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Can't tell you how many times I resigned my commission in the Virginia Regiment during those 7 long years of what we call the 7 Years' War. Okay, the war actually lasted almost 10 years in reality. How many times I resigned my commission? There was one time, it was the very first time I visited the grand city of New York. And this was back in 1756. And I was on my way up to Boston to visit Governor Shirley, who was then the new Commander-in-Chief of the British Armed Forces in North America, as we are still fighting against the French. During that visit, a good friend of mine, the son of the Speaker of the House of Burgesses in Virginia, his name is Beverly Robinson, who was a colonel, was getting married to one of the sisters that lived in Phillips Manor Hall just south of us. So I was there for that wedding. And the young lady that was getting married had a sister by the name of Mary Phillips. I know there's some people floating about there today. There's some reporter, I forget her name, journalist, writing all these stories saying that I attended this fancy ball for St. Valentine's Day. Well, we don't celebrate St. Valentine's Day back in 1756, let alone a grand ball. And plus, I didn't arrive in New York City till the day after, on September 15th. So maybe there's some bits of truth, maybe talking briefly to this young lady. I have no memory of it. But that was my first visit to New York. Remember, my main goal was to travel up to Boston. When I got up to Boston, the governor was very courteous towards me. He was more interested in hearing about his son who died bravely at Monongahela, out there where General Braddock was killed back in July of 1755. But he didn't want to hear anything about me asking to be colonel in the regular standing British Army.
Well, it couldn't be said that maybe your temper and your youth and your inexperience might be to blame?
Quite possibly, and I guess I inherited that from my mother as well. But she did try to help us out, and she did help make me, of course, who I am today. But in my youth, yes, I guess I was impetuous. I guess that I was a little too brash about just running in there, demanding things, not knowing the way of the world at the time.
Perhaps that's why your mother had a bullwhip tied to her side.
Oh yes, I remember that.
You.
I remember that well. Thank goodness I never had to be on the receiving end of that. But that's when I realized in 1756, you can only go so far if you live here in the colonies. We think ourselves as British subjects. I see myself as an English country squire in Virginia, but it's not the reality. At this time, in 1756-57, I happened to have been renting out the house of my deceased brother, Lawrence Washington. His wife was still alive at the time, and I would pay her yearly to stay there. Of course, eventually I do inherit Mount Vernon. Oh, by the way, Mount Vernon, the name comes from Admiral Vernon, had to be a British admiral. That was my brother, half-brother was under the command of at that battle I told you about, the Battle of Jenkins Ear. That's why we call it Mount Vernon still today. But 1758 is when my life takes another turn. When I meet a lovely young lady, Martha Dandridge Custis, the lady that stands here before us. March of 1758 was the first time I visited her home. And here I am trying to show off, heavily tipping the people who work on our property, helping bringing the baggage into our house. Of course, I had no business doing that because I really didn't have that much money at that time in life. But we hit it off grandly. We have a lot in common. A lot of people think of this lady here sitting in the window of our home with a spinning wheel, knitting or sewing. There's a lot more to her than that. Wasn't it true that you were managing the property that you lived on?
Indeed, I had no choice. I had all 5 properties in trust for my eldest son, Jackie.
She's doing all the billings. She's doing all the bookkeeping on her property, holding it for her son, Jackie, when he becomes of age. So, she's a pretty smart, astute woman, and she's very good at math. And we learned that. We had a lot of good ideas about farming as well. So now I start writing her letters. And on my second visit, that's when I decided to propose to her. Now, she's land rich, but cash poor. So I want everybody to get that part straight. So I'm not inheriting a lot of money by marrying her. There is no money there. There is more property than anything else, but that's about it. And a lot of people, of course, say I wanted to be involved with that other lady 2 years earlier, Mary Phillips, because her family owned 1.5 million acres of land, going from the Kingsbridge in Lower Yonkers all the way up to the village of Sleepy Hollow.
Well, General, it's a good thing that you moved as quickly as you did, because as you know, I was being courted by King Carter. He was an attorney, and he was one of the
Yes.
wealthiest landowners in Tidewater, Virginia.
Next to the Fairfax family, his family, the Carter family, were the richest in Virginia. You're absolutely correct.
Correct, and also, if you remember correctly, my former father-in-law, through my first husband Daniel, he was also was very wealthy.
Yes.
And his only son Daniel, who was the scion of the family, fell in love with me and wanted to propose, but his father said absolutely not until I meet this girl. Of course, he thought perhaps I was an adventuress looking for money, but I had a meeting out of the palm of my hand after we met.
And one of the things I love about you,
Whatever would I do without you, General?
the same with me. That's why I love my darling Patsy, by the way, that's her nickname. My stepdaughter, her daughter, by the way, her name was Martha as well, and we also called her Patsy. Now, tell her about the children.
Oh my goodness. Well, from my first marriage to Daniel, we were blessed with 4 children. We had 2, however, that died in infancy, which was very common in those days. And that was a very difficult burden for a mother to bear. And when I met you, you were very, very magnanimous, and you almost adopted my 2 remaining children as your own. You certainly treated them as such.
I did, and I tried to enroll poor Jackie in college time after time, at least 4 times. One of my visits to New York City, my second visit actually, was in 1771. The final university that we enrolled Jackie in, but unfortunately, once I left him in the city, he was going to King's College at this time. King's College was part of Trinity Church on Wall Street at the time, and he got back to his old ways of gambling and drinking, and unfortunately, that June of 1771, disaster hit.
Well, you mustn't be so hard on him, General. After all, he was my only remaining child and my only son, who stood to inherit everything his forefather had given us. It was a big tragedy after I had endured yet another earlier one with my daughter, Patsy.
Patsy is the one who dies in 1771. She dies of epilepsy, by the way. And it really hit her very badly.
The last seizure was the worst. It took her off right away.
Yes, I do remember that. I was there holding her in my arms as it was happening.
I remember we suffered through episode after episode, and the last and final one was the worst. In fact, you tried everything known to us at the time to help support her, but even to the point of getting a special ring that she could teeth on so that she wouldn't hurt herself during a seizure. But it wasn't to be. That was my 3rd gone.
But I could totally understand now that I look back at everything, how you treated Jackie, your last child.
Well, what's a mother to do?
Exactly. I saw you.
You'll forgive my indulgence, perhaps,
Yes.
or overindulgence of him.
And I do. I totally understand. Now, unfortunately, poor Jackie, when he's following the Army, he was an officer in the Continental Army, right after the Battle of Yorktown, early November, 1781, he dies of camp fever. So in reality, she lost 4 children throughout her life.
You forget our youngest grandchild.
That's true.
Unfortunately, we thought that it was over, but he went the way of his father. Gambling, wastrel, drinker.
And that's why my nephew, who was Supreme Court Justice under President Adams, Bushrod, Washington, inherits Mount Vernon when I pass on. Because my step-grandson was doing the same thing that his father was doing, drinking, gambling, each time enrolled in a university, leaving, not making anything of himself. So I would say Bushrod at that time was the only family member who made anything of himself.
It's very reminiscent of my friend Abigail Adams and her son,
Yes.
if you remember correctly.
I do.
Similar situation, so sad.
Yeah, absolutely. So, 1776 is when I took command of the New York garrison after I arrived in New York City on the 13th of April. So my first job at this time is to fortify Manhattan Island. Village of Harlem is a farming community. Bloomingdale also. If you want to realize where Bloomingdale is, think about the New York Historical Society. the museum where those dinosaur bones sit, that is the village of Bloomingdale. And down over here you have Greenwich Village. That's exactly what it is. It's a village. And there's a house not too far from there, which I used in 1776, by the way, as my headquarters. And then there's the village of, there's a little piece of property called Chelsea. That was purchased by Major Thomas Clark. He's an elderly, retired British major. Probably never heard of Major Thomas Clark. You might have heard of his grandson, Clement Clark Moore, who in 1822 writes a very famous Christmas poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas. He's the one who starts Chelsea. So the main fortification is down over here. That's Fort George. And that's where the artillery company is. So by March of 1776, you have a young 20-year-old captain of the New York City Artillery, our good friend, Mr. Alexander Hamilton. And you're probably wondering, why are we scurrying about it? Why are we bringing all our troops here in New York? What's going on? Well, the British are about to take over New York. And why do they want New York? They want to control the Hudson River. And if they control the Hudson River, they control all communication from the New England colonies to the middling colonies, and of course, to the southern colonies. You've been raising your hand so patiently. We're going to help you out, young man.
My cousins live in Philadelphia.
Very good. You know it's a wonderful town, right?
Perhaps you have the acquaintance of Dr. Franklin.
And Philadelphia also was the place where I was given my commission on June 17th, 1775, and they made me Commander-in-Chief of the Army. But you want to know something about June 17th, 1775? Do you know how many people were in the Continental Army?
Yeah.
One! It was me! We had no recruits yet. There was no
Dr.
army.
Franklin would probably appreciate this young man's
Absolutely.
astuteness. In fact, he could be another aide-de-camp like Hamilton.
That's true. Or you could help out. There's a young friend of mine. His name is Mr. Milner. And he's a young lad like yourself. Maybe you want to be a drummer like him in the Army as well. He's only slightly older than you.
Are you sure you would want this young man to serve as a
Well,
drummer?
if he should be pretty safe if he's with my lifeguard.
You think so?
Yes. But stay away from a gentleman by the name of Captain Hickey in the lifeguard, because he tries to do something very nasty. He tries to have me assassinated. That's not a good idea, is it? But he was...
on the $1 bill.
Oh, I'm on the $1 bill. Well, I can tell you, when I was president, towards the end of my presidency, I was on a penny, but $1 bill, that's pretty good. I guess I'm moving up here.
This young man has possibilities.
Very good. Very smart, very astute. You need to go to King's College, or possibly to Yale, or any of the other fine universities here in the college.
Perhaps you could put him in touch with Hamilton.
Yes.
He might need a banker to help out.
That's right. You could be, you could be apprenticed under him. How'd you like that? You could work with Mr. Hamilton, work your way up, get into finance, or possibly be a lawyer. There's a lot of grand lawyers here. There's a gentleman by the name of Aaron Burr who has his office at a church south of here in the village of Eastchester. Maybe we could introduce you to Mr. Burr. But be very careful. He gets a little persnickety, and I think he's going to get into a big fight one day with Hamilton. I hope it never happens, though. I wouldn't want to see anything happen to that young man from St. Nevis. It'd be very sad to see that, wouldn't it?
That's the second encounter you've had with the Caribbean. If you remember your half-brother
Oh,
Lawrence.
yes! I actually visited the Caribbean once. And I was in Barbados. Because when my half-brother was sick, the doctors told him he had to go to a warmer climate to recover. I was about 19, I guess, at the time. And that was the first time I tasted what's called an avocado, and I thought it was the most wonderful thing. I'd never tasted one of those before. And you know, the first time I went to a theater was in Barbados as well, professional theater. I started non-professional performances in the village of Fredericksburg, where I lived with my mother, but that was the first professional performance I saw of Cato, my favorite play. And a lot of us, of course, enjoy that play as well. It's an old Roman story. But while I was in Barbados, unfortunately, I got sick. And it came down with a very, very bad disease called smallpox. Now, the equivalent to smallpox, I guess, would be that nasty thing that was going on in your 21st century world. That started about 4 years ago. That's how bad smallpox could be if it broke out in your village. Probably you would lose 70% of the population. Luckily, I did survive smallpox.
Well, it's not the first time that smallpox reared its ugly head.
That's true. It was here a long time here in the colonies. So I decided to go back home to Virginia. And you know what happened on the way home on board a ship? Not only did I get sick from the ship rocking back and forth, that made your stomach feel uneasy, right? It'd be hard to hold your lunch in or whatever. So when I arrived back home and I got off the boat, I realized something was missing on my person. Do you know what that was? Somebody pilfered my wallet. So that's why I have never traveled outside these United States ever again. I will not travel on a sailing ship again. I don't want to be robbed. I don't want to be sick either.
It's probably a good thing then that your mother insisted you not become a midshipman in the British Navy.
I guess so. Probably wouldn't have fared well. Would have been a bad idea, I guess, right?
And as difficult as the death of your half-brother, you did have later on the astuteness to have all of your soldiers inoculated against smallpox.
Yes. That was a very
You remember
smart
the
thing
first
to
time.
do. So always make sure if there's something bad out there, get your inoculation. And make
Not to
sure to
mention-
stay healthy. Yes.
Not to mention the fact that your camps had to be cleaned up.
Oh, please, another story with the camps. When I first took command of the Continental Army, when I arrived up in Boston on July 3rd, 1775, I could not believe what was going on. You had officers shaving privates in the company streets. Imagine all these benches here are rows of tents. These would be called company streets. An officer, a captain, a colonel shaving his private men. That is not my idea of how an army should behave. But that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is when I arrived there July 3rd of 1775, it was a Sunday morning. And my understanding of people who live in Massachusetts wasn't what was going on in the camps. People are brawling, they're fighting, they're drunk. People are, let's just say, relieving themselves in the company streets as well. It was just awful, and I had to instill discipline. And it was an uphill battle. But yes, I do remember that. I remember that brawl when I first arrived.
Ruffians and hooligans the entire lot.
Oh yes, absolutely. And you know, here we go. You have a captain shaving a private. We don't do that. And they're voting for their officers. No, we need people with experience.
The officer
You seem to
shaved his hair.
Oh, I don't know if he shaved his hair, but there are gentlemen that do shave their heads to wear a wig. You might want to do that. If you decide to wear a fancy wig, you have to remove most of your hair. Leave a little bit of a buzz on there, because that holds the wig on, kind of like, what's that funny stuff that you call Velcro?
After they shave their hair, they're bald.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Mr. Franklin is losing his hair.
My babysitter said she would shave my hair.
Okay, all right.
When you're ready to retire your wig, young sir,
Yes.
you could put it on a blockhead. We happen to have one.
Absolutely, that's what that wooden object was that was toppling over. But, of course, you know Dr. Franklin was, let's say, follically challenged, as is my good friend Mr. Adams as well. Thank goodness I still have my hair, although you can see how gray it's going. It's no longer reddish-brown.
And I want to say, if your hair real?
Of course it's real. Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. The most astute gentlemen, they would always be seen in public with a wig done to its best. In fact, everyone did.
But it is a fashion to wear wigs, in my day anyway. I don't know about your day. Maybe it is, maybe not. Have no idea. You look like you're very comfortable over there. You comfortable? You're not? Okay.
I'm sure he's probably taking in all this information,
I'm sure.
considering enlistment.
When you get into the 4th grade, you're going to learn a lot more about this. But the only difference is today, you get to see it in person. You get to see it live. Which is kind of cool, right?
I'm so glad, young man, that you noticed the general's wig. You did have your natural hair toward the end of your life, but a lot more can be said about your teeth.
Yes. Oh, did you have to bring up the teeth?
My
My
apologies,
teeth?
sir.
I have a grown-up tooth.
That's good. Hold on to that grown-up tooth, because I only have 2 grown-up teeth left.
How many do you happen to have, young sir?
I only have one.
Well, that's okay. I'm sure you'll grow another, so
Yes.
you'll have 2 serviceable teeth. He can enlist.
Good. That's your first one. Most of mine are gone, of course. But my dentures are not made out of wood.
And when I go to the haircut place that's in my town, they already have gumball machines, so when I go there, I just eat one so I can get them out of my mouth.
Okay.
Oh, my goodness.
That's interesting.
I
I have to look into this weird thing called a gumball. I don't know. Does it come from the gum tree or something? I know there was a tree.
I mean, things perhaps it's sugar, and more sugar.
Oh, no, stay
the
away from
Caribbean.
sugar. I can tell you, stay away from sugar. That's what's doing my teeth in. And do not crack walnuts with your teeth either. That's not a good idea.
don't
Please.
even know what that means.
Okay.
Please, youngster, don't indulge yourself either in raw candy, my
Yes.
favorite.
Unfortunately, she's having problems with her
I
teeth.
taste raw candy.
Okay, well, don't eat too much candy. Because I can tell you about my dentures. Most of the teeth in the dentures that I wear come from either carved hippopotamus tusk or baby cow teeth, calf teeth. And sometimes people from the lower classes would actually sell their teeth. You want to wear somebody else's teeth in your mouth? I don't think you do. No. And they're very uncomfortable. There's springs that sometimes just poke into the inside of the cheeks of my mouth, and it's very, very painful.
Well, you have to remember, General, Paul Revere, is that his name? He actually made you a set of dentures, did he
Yes,
not?
you did. Yes, you did. Absolutely.
And also, the fact of selling teeth, that is something that was done for many centuries in Europe.
I believe the French surgeons were experimenting with that.
Why would they sell teeth in a store?
Well, it's not so much a store. You would call it a dentist office. My day, you go to a surgeon. And you have these surgeons, these doctors, that are playing around with the idea of fixing people's teeth. So I guess there's some sort of like a craftsman, somebody who makes things, right? So you would have somebody who's very destitute, they're desperate for money, and they think, well, you know, I could lose a couple of teeth. I might be able to sell them to somebody. So let me sit in the surgeon's office. Maybe there's a customer coming in, and then I could make some money that way.
Perhaps they should have done better to go to a physician and not a barber surgeon.
That is true. So stay away from a dentist. Oh, and doctors. Oh, forget about the doctors. Because if you get sick, the first thing they're going to do is, let's see, you have too much fluid in your body. So we're going to have to take out maybe a couple of pints of blood.
Are you referring to the 4 humors?
Yes,
You are indeed.
because doctors in my day believe in earth, wind, fire, and water. And if something's wrong with your body, some of these elements are out of whack inside your body. So they'll do something called bloodletting. Sometimes they put leeches on you. Sometimes they do something called cupping, where they get these little glass cups. They put it over a candle and warm it up so it create a suction to create blisters. Do you think you want to go through that? I don't think so. And as for surgeons, I've seen a lot of soldiers wounded on the battlefield. And when you go to a surgeon's office to visit a surgeon, you don't want to know about this. And I'm not going to tell you about it because it gets very bad.
Why did you tell me?
Well, I'm going to be brief about it.
You're going to frighten the young man.
Well, I'll be brief about it. Imagine going to the doctor's office and somebody has to do surgery on you, but you're not sleeping and you're wide awake. That's how surgery is in my day. There's
Perhaps
no,
they can give him a tincture of opium, poppy.
maybe
He
some
seems too
rum.
young to me to drink.
Well, sometimes children drink wine and small beer.
Of course, but going to a surgeon, you might want something a little stronger, perhaps whiskey, if you
Maybe.
can find it,
That's
or the
true.
ubiquitous rum.
But keep
Sugar
in mind, the doctor's going to charge you for that like they charge you for everything. Keep that in mind. And I know things do not change in your century either with them.
Well, most likely the physician, given his tender age, would use leeches as a bloodletter.
Maybe.
That's more common with young women and also children. It doesn't tend to leave a mark. Otherwise, he'll bleed you with a flame in a bowl.
Yes. So, now, let's get back to this map just briefly. You could see Lady Washington is very much interested in medicine, but there's very few women that are practicing medicine in our day. But like I said, she is very astute, she is very smart, and she likes to know about the world. So, right over here, Imagine New York Harbor filled up with about 150 British warships, because by the time we get...
Seaweed gum.
No, don't eat them. So by the time we get to July of 1776, 100 British warships are in the harbor. And the British arrive with about 33,000 troops. 9,000 to 10,000 come from the Principality of Hesse-Kassel. That's why we call them Hessians. We don't call them Germans because the country of unified Germany doesn't exist just yet. And on August 27th, 1776, right over here at the bottom of the map, Gravesend Bay is where they land, and they attack Long Island. Now, you know that battle is the Battle of Brooklyn. Well, I call it the Battle of Long Island because Brooklyn's just a tiny...
My friend has named Brooklyn.
Okay, that's a very good name to have, and it's an old Dutch name, actually. So, over here, we have the Battle of Long Island. And it lasts the whole entire day. And I lost about 3,000 troops that day because we only have 13,000 men. The British outnumber us 3-1. And after one day of fighting, we lost 3,000. 3,000 men is a lot to lose. The following day, it's raining very heavily. Remember that heavy rain we had in September and October? We had 10 weekends of rain. There was that one Friday in October where all the rivers around here were flooded, the parkways were flooded. That's how heavy the rain came down on the 28th of August, 1776. So I want to try to evacuate 9,000 men out of New York City, or actually out of Long Island to New York City. And there's a gentleman we heard about a little bit earlier on, Colonel John Glover. Colonel John Glover's from Marblehead, Massachusetts. He's a sailor by trade. All the men in his 14th Continental Regiment are sailors too. He promises me in the village of Red Hook, which is right about here at the Red Lion Inn, that he's going to evacuate the remaining 9,000 men off of Long Island. Now I'm sitting there trying to figure out how is he going to pull this off. Remember, it's still raining out. It's raining very heavily. The battles have stopped because gunpowder, of course, we all know does not burn in the rain when it gets wet. So the following day, a fog rolls into the harbor. And all those British soldiers on board those sailing ships, along with the sailors, they can't really see what's going on, but they might be able to hear rowboats rowing across the harbor, bringing 9,000 troops to safety back to New York City. So during that night, Colonel Glover decides to muffle the oars, meaning wrapping rags around it, so when you pull it back and it swivels, it's not going to squeak and make noise. Miraculously, he was able to get all 9,000 men safely back to New York. I made sure I was on the last boat out off of Long Island that evening. The following day, as the sun came up, the last boat crossed the harbor. Now my job, under the President of the Congress, John Hancock, is to protect New York City at all costs, to barricade it. So I'm trying to protect the city, to keep it from falling to the British. The British are beginning their 7-year occupation of Long Island, which is going to turn into the occupation of New York City next. So I moved my headquarters from No. 1 Broadway up to Harlem. I'm staying at a house of a retired colonel who fled up to Canada with his wife. That gentleman's name was Colonel Roger Morris. His wife's name was Mary Phillips, the young lady I was telling you about earlier on. So they flee to Canada. My headquarters is here, and it's pretty much a waiting game. We don't know what the British are going to do next. And a week and a half later, on September 15th, the British take New York City. It falls without a fight, and more troops land right here in Kips Bay. Now, Kips Bay is part of the property that belonged to the Murray family, Murray Hill in Manhattan. That was their farm. Wheat happens to be the cash crop, so it's a wheat farm. And on September 15th, you had thousands of British troops coming ashore. And that day was a very sad day to witness what happened. Here I am on horse. I'm sitting on the back of Nelson. I'm riding my horse back and forth between the troops. I have all these young men there. Now, some of them are probably scared, nervous. First battle of the war, the true full-blown battle, the largest battle just took place a week and a half later, the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Brooklyn, as you call it. And those men were very nervous, the militia units, the Pennsylvania regiment standing before me. The second the British came ashore, fixed bayonets, most of them turned and ran. I'm here on horseback wondering what just happened. Are these the men which we're expected to defend our liberty with? Was the first thing that came to mind. I am yelling. I'm yelling at the sergeants to get these men back in line and keeping them from running up the Albany Post roads and fleeing. I'm yelling at the sergeants as well. Get these men back. Taking the back of the blade of my sword, hitting them on the back. Nobody's listening. And this was probably the most upsetting time for me. The fall of 1776. We lost the Battle of Long Island. We lost Kips Bay now. And that evening, as the Americans are fleeing up the road here towards Harlem, they're finally stopped the following morning on the 16th of September, Battle of Harlem Heights. Only now, those same men that I saw that were running away in fear were actually fighting back. They were holding their ground. I was able to escape with thousands of my troops up to Kingsbridge, crossing Spike Diable Creek, to the Miles Square Road, finally to the Old Army Road. I'm trying to get the Army to escape to get up to the city of White Plains. Another part of the Army here on the east side is under the command of Colonel Glover. And Colonel Glover is over here, and on the morning of October 18th, he sees through his spyglass 4,000 British troops coming ashore at Split Rock in the village of Eastchester. The Battle of Pell's Point. Yes, we are losing these battles, but they are delayed tactics to hold back the bulk of the British Army, to keep us from being captured, to keep from disaster happening. And then after the Battle of Pell's Point, you have the Battle of Heathcote Hill. And then, of course, the battle here, the Battle of White Plains, where I'm staying at two separate houses not too far from here. There's the Miller House. There's also Jacob Purdy's home as well. Now, during the Battle of White Plains, luckily, there was a rainstorm. And I could say, maybe that's divine providence trying to save us yet again, to save us from disaster. And finally, I did evacuate out of Westchester County and cross over the Hudson River in early November.
It would be the first time that you evaded capture or death.
Oh, I was almost captured over here in Long Island. I was so furious when I was in Kips Bay, when I was on Nelson. I'm trying to go full speed ahead towards the enemy, and supposedly a young man pulls on the rein of the horse. I don't know who he was. I know he was a lieutenant. People claim it was young Aaron Burr, a gentleman we all know about from later on in history. But that was a disaster, losing New York in 1776. And that's why, year after year, leading up to 1781, my main goal was to expel the British out of New York. I didn't know how it was going to be done. We tried many, many times. We tried by going down through the Kingsbridge. But unfortunately, up here in the hills, you have all these fortifications, manned by loyalists, manned by the Hessians. So each time we went down there was a disaster. But I was hoping in 1781 in July, when a good friend from France came down here with about 6,000 men, General Rochambeau, where we had many, many discussions at the Odell House in Hartsdale, talking about the possibility of now we have combined 12,000 men, and we might have enough to expel the British off of Manhattan Island. I remember going down on a grand reconnaissance down to Throg's Neck, which back in my day is called Frog's Neck, by the way. You can see that on the map there, or Frog's Point. And I remember going there with Rochambeau, and we're there trying to see the strength of the army. There was just too many British troops at Fort Prince of Wales in northern Manhattan, Fort George, Fort Kniphausen, which of course was previously called Fort Washington, prior to November 16th of 1776. Finally, as the summer went on, I was talked out of the idea of attacking. Admiral de Grasse is down in the Caribbean. He has more troops. The problem with the French warships, the drafts are too heavy. They're heavy laden ships. So to try to get them into the harbor might be another disaster. And that's when we decided, let's try to fool the British. There's that little spy ring we have running since 1778, the Culper spy ring, and they don't start giving us some traction till around 1780, where we try to get good information finally.
General, you might want to be a little bit careful about divulging that information.
Well, now that it's all over, I'm not going to give out names. I don't even know the names of most of the people. That's why they have code names.
It would be most dishonorable. Remember that young man, Nathan Hale?
Oh yes,
God rest
and
him.
that's why I waited till 1778, till Colonel Talmadge convinced me we needed some sort of a spy network. We knew we weren't going to win the war for the amount of soldiers we have. We know the only way to win the war is to lie to the enemy. So yes, can I tell a lie? Absolutely. If I didn't, we would have lost this war. So, by the time we get later into the summer, August of 1781, we're lighting beacon fires up here. You have a plantation owned by Colonel James Van Cortlandt. You call that Van Cortlandt Park. Vault Hill. There was torches there lit to make it look like there was American troops there. Over here in Bergen County. So the British thought they were being surrounded. So we left information, we left maps, we left notations in packets, like a bag we have over here in front of my desk, at a tavern being run by Mr. Rivington in the city, which a lot of the British officers went to. And they fell for the idea thinking, they're going to be attacked here. They had no idea we were sneaking away, marching down to Virginia. And of course you had the Battle of Yorktown. So I would say if it wasn't for the deceit, if it wasn't for the lies through the Culper spy ring, we might have been found out what we were trying to do. We might have been prevented from marching down to Virginia.
Well, all's fair in love and war.
Absolutely. And that's how we won Yorktown. That's how we were able to have enough French soldiers here, because General Clinton, the commander of the British Army in New York, was a very cautious gentleman. And he decided, when he got that information out of that tavern, well, maybe we need our garrison here. We cannot send thousands of troops to supplement the southern campaign down along the James River in Yorktown, Virginia. The last important battle of the war. Not the end of the war. The war does not end on October 19, 1781. It actually ends, I would say, with a document that I've read on April 19, 1783 at Vales Gate, the last winter cantonment, talking about all cessation of hostilities has ended towards the enemy. In effect, the war is over. There's no peace treaty yet. That's not signed till September of 1783. So now I'm in negotiations. I'm in negotiations of releasing troops because we disbanded the army by the time the British left on November 25th of 1783. My first meeting with Sir Guy Carleton, the last Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, was across the river from us, near a tavern which is called the 1776 House in the village of Old Tapan. And I meet up with Sir Guy Carleton, and we start discussing about when the British are leaving. But they had a big problem because they had about 350,000 loyalists that wanted to leave. They felt uncomfortable. They're waiting to get passage. There's not enough ships. Originally, they were supposed to leave a little bit earlier than they did, but there was not enough landing craft for them to just get out of here. Most of them went to Canada. Some went to the Caribbean. You actually had some that stayed here. Remember earlier on, I told you about that judge, Theodosius Fowler, who lived in the village of Eastchester, who never spoke to his son ever again. He came back from Canada. They're in the same underground burial vault in St. Paul's Church. There's another gentleman also, the town supervisor of Eastchester, Stephen Ward. His brother Edmund Ward was a loyalist. He also goes to Canada. Again, they come back. They're about 100 yards away from each other in the same burial ground. So they might have been enemies during life, and death they're all together now.
In general, you must not forget the Hessians. They settled many of them in
A
Pennsylvania.
lot of them did stay in Pennsylvania. I would say maybe about a fourth or a fifth, maybe as much as a third, that ended up deserting, go to Pennsylvania. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania is not Pennsylvania Dutch. It's a misnomer. It's Pennsylvania Deutsch. It's the English corruption of the word. So they happen to be all of German descent, German settlers that
So
happen
your
to be there.
ruse with the German baker trying to get them over
Yeah.
to our side worked.
Yes, it did. It absolutely did. So now, the time for the British to leave. They formally leave on the 25th of November, 1783, and it was a holiday celebrated in your world up until 1916. And it was called Evacuation Day. And it was the third Thursday every November. That changes in 1916 to a different parade for a very good reason. 1916, what's going on in your world?
World War I.
World War I. And we are the #1 supplier of armaments, about to be an ally with Great Britain. So it doesn't look good for us to celebrate a holiday that's technically anti-British. No, I personally leave New York City on the 4th of December, 1783, after I have a lunch at Francis Tavern, where I bid farewell to all my officers, hoping that I'm going to return back home in time for Christmas. And you were very happy when I did make it for Christmas Day.
Yes, you did indeed return, and shortly thereafter, not that very long, you were called to serve in the presidency.
Absolutely. Here I am thinking I'm going to retire to the shade of a fig tree, drinking a glass of Madeira along the Potomac River. And of course that wasn't to happen.
General, excuse me, but the Madeira, no sugar.
Yes, you're right.
And port,
Absolutely.
too.
I try my best.
And rum.
And rum. Well, I don't drink too much rum, do I? All right. I won't
You are
lie.
entertaining many officers, and as a president, you do have to keep people entertained to make connections.
That is true. So of course we know what happens 4 years later in 1787 when they nominate me to preside over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And then that's over, 4 months later, I'm thinking again, I'm out of public life for good. I'm going to retire back home. But as I told you in the beginning, what happened to me on this day, April 14, 1789, when I got that knock on the door, being told I was unanimously elected president. Did I know about this? Of course I did. Because I was in contact as early as February of 1789 with my good friend Mr. Hamilton, who was sending me letters about the votes and what was going on. I also knew from another good friend of mine, Henry Lee, sending me letters as well. And of course my good friend Henry Knox. And when I got that letter from Henry Knox on April 6th, I told him, I feel like a culprit going to my execution. But that's a short version of my life, and my darling wife here, Lady Washington, and I want to thank each and every one of you for having us here this afternoon.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for your service to this country.
Oh,
Does anybody have any questions here for George and Martha?
I
Yes.
don't have a question, but there's a book called Mount Vernon, A Love Story.
yes.
Have you read it? Yeah, 'cause-
I have a copy. I haven't read it just yet.
Yes, 'cause-
You can imagine a tremendous amount of books both of us have to read.
That's why I was.
My main
Like
book.
pile of things to read.
Oh yes,
I would
absolutely.
recommend it though, because
Yeah.
it's not very long. It is considered a novel because she has dialect in it. It
Right.
was, a dialogue rather, dialogue. And it was written by Mary Higgins Clark.
Oh yes,
It was
yes.
one of the surprises that I realized who the author was, but she had done major research
Yes.
for some kind of program, and she decided to write a book.
Yeah.
And it's about your relationship, as you know, a little bit more than.
Oh, absolutely.
And I love the opening because it opens with Adams' inauguration,
Yes.
and then it goes back. But I would recommend it. I did get it out of the library, but then my copy came directly from Mount Vernon.
Okay, excellent.
And it's good fundraiser because Mount Vernon gets no
Absolutely.
public funds.
Yes. So, some of the artisans that worked on the exhibit they have in Mount Vernon called the real George Washington. It has him at 19, 45, and when he becomes president in his 50s. I know pretty much all the tailors that worked on the clothing because I've taken their courses. Because not only do I present as Washington, I want the clothing to look right. I make my own clothing. I have about 24 different 18th century outfits. My poor wife, she's actually my wife in real life. My poor wife keeps asking me to make her a gown. After 18 years, I still haven't made her a gown.
The tailor's wife has no clothes.
Have you read Rick Atkinson's book, British Are Coming?
I have a copy of it. I haven't read it yet.
It reads like a novel.
Yeah.
There were two things that you mentioned in it that stuck out to me when you mentioned Henry Knox.
Right.
Henry Knox left Boston and went to Fort Ticonderoga to get the cannon to
Yes.
bring him back. What he did is he had to cross the Connecticut River, and it was winter time. And these smart Yankees, it was unbelievable to me.
Yeah.
When they went across, they dug holes in the ice so that the water would come up to make the ice thicker so that the cannon could go across it and not sink into the river. I mean, who thinks of that? Henry Knox thought.
Right. Think about how heavy the artillery is. Just the metal part, not even the limber that it's on with the wheels. You're dealing with 4,000 pounds of metal. And these men are just going across the tundra. I remember at the age of 7 looking at all these wonderful old American heritage history books they used to sell in the supermarket. My parents used to get them for me. And there's a lovely painting. It was probably done in the 1920s or 30s. And it's showing you Knox and his men going over what looked like the frozen tundra of Russia, crossing over with all these cannons. The actual painting actually is at Fort Ticonderoga in their collection.
To me, that was smart. The other thing that you talked about was the smallpox.
Right.
And in Atkinson's book, he talks about they would find somebody who had smallpox and they would get their knives, they would cut themselves and take the pus from it and inoculate and give themselves inoculation. And I'm sitting there going, that was pretty remarkable.
There's a good example of that in the miniseries that was done on HBO years ago on John Adams. John Adams is away, he's over in Paris, his children are suffering from smallpox, and Abigail's trying to get the kids inoculated. There was one child, he's probably far gone, he has the pustules all over his body, and the surgeon keeps going out to him in the wagon and taking the thread, because what they would do is make an incision, rub the thread in there, and take that thread, make a cut in somebody who's healthy, and inoculate them with the smallpox.
If not a thread, then a quill.
Yeah, it would have been done with a quill as well. They show that scene as well.
Yeah. Tom.
Just a question. I noticed that Mrs. Washington referred to you as General.
Yes.
When you became president, were you still referred to as the General? And
You know what? That's a good question, because I know during his generalship, she called him the General. When she first met him, she called him the Colonel. She never called him by his name, George. And one of the things I like to play with sometimes, I'm out at certain events, and I'm just with the people, walking around floor level with them, and they call me George. I says, oh, you can't call me George. My own wife does not even call me George. I'm the General or His Excellency.
But you have to remember, though, behind every successful man is a successful woman.
We all know.
But this has been a passion with me since I was about 7 years old. My first visit to Valley Forge was at the Cub Scouts when I was 7.
Neil, did you have a question? Okay. Anyone else? Great. Well,
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank
you.